Our presenters today are Riane Eisler, author of The Chalice and the Blade, The Real Wealth of Nations, and Nurturing Our Humanity, as well as many other books and articles, and presenting at workshops, etc. She is also president of the Center of Partnership Studies. Presenting also is Brian Fullman, who's the lead organizer of Barbershop and Black Congregation Cooperative, in partnership with Isaiah. Laura Johnson is a lead organizer, program organizer of Isaiah. And me, I'm Sharon Sund. I currently work at Conflict Resolution Center. I am on the central leadership team for Isaiah, and I am a caring economy advocate for the Center of Partnership Studies. Next slide. The path to real prosperity and a multiracial democracy is a caring economy and a partnership society. Next slide. To construct an economic system that can help us meet the enormous needs and challenges that we face, we must give visibility and value to the work of caring for people and for nature. I will invite Riane Eisler to explain.
Well, thank you, Sharon. And it's a pleasure to be with you here today. And by all means, go to the next slide. I've introduced a new economic that goes beyond both capitalism and socialism to include the three life-sustaining sectors of the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy, and to really give value to the work of caring for people starting in childhood and caring for our natural environment. And once we do this, next slide, please, we really have a way of understanding racism from a whole systems perspective, because, and I want to very briefly explore with you the cultural roots of our economy and, yes, of racism next. Now, to overcome racism, you really have to overcome and change the social structure that created it. Next. And to do this, we really have to think, you know, Einstein said it, he said, we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them. So underneath, right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, capitalist, socialist, are two underlying social configurations that are very relevant to the problem and the challenge of changing the in-group versus out-group thinking of racism. The domination system and the partnership system, and or rather the domination partnership scale, which really, as I said, transcends these old categories, because if you really think about them, you've had racism, anti-Semitism, in-group, out-group thinking, violence, oppression in every one of our old categories. Moreover, these old categories, and this is something I really want to emphasize, either marginalize or leave out the majority of humanity, women and children. So in domination systems, well, you have rigid hierarchies of control. In partnership systems, because we need new language, don't we? We have flexible hierarchies of actualization where power is used to empower rather than disempower. So that takes us to the next one, power over versus power with and power to, our creative power. And we don't have these superior, inferior, in-group, out-group relations, but rather relations of mutual respect. And yes, mutual accountability and mutual benefit. And of course, rather than only having the alternatives as Mr. Trump, for example, said, it's all about domination, of either you dominate or you're dominated. There is a partnership alternative, and that alternative means that, well, that nurturing and sustaining life is a top social and really political, it's a priority in all of our institutions. Next slide, please. Now, when we think in terms of capitalism versus socialism, what we fail to recognize is something that in my book, The Real Wealth of Nations, I've discussed in some length, that both are really rooted in times, well, they came out of the early industrial times, the 1700s, the 1800s. Today, we're well into the post-industrial 21st century economy, but they also came out of times that oriented more to the domination side of the social scale, in which rigid top-down rankings were supposed to be divinely ordained, right? Whether it was the divinely ordained so-called right of kings to rule, or of men to rule, or of one race, so-called superior race, to rule over so-called inferior ones. Now, domination systems has really, it wasn't always so, and I really discussed this in great length in my book, The Chalice and the Blade, but for about 600 plus years, there's been suffering and injustice caused by domination system. But the really important thing is that there is another way. We can't just deconstruct, we have to reconstruct. So we can build a social and economic system that overcomes racism, supports mutual respect, and nonviolence and equality and empowerment and caring. And it's called partnerism. Next, please. So partnerism is a social economic system where all relationships, starting in the family, going all the way to religion, to politics, to economics, to the media, where all relations, institutions, policies, and organizations are based on principles of equitable partnership that supports linking rather than ranking, and, as I said, hierarchies of actualization rather than hierarchies of domination. And the point here is that it is within such a social system, and we really have to think systemically, that we cannot have this in-group versus out-group thinking and acting and institutions in a partnerism society. That's why we have to really think of whole systems change. Next, please. Now, I'm going to hand it over to Sharon.
Thank you, Riane. So the core principles of partnership economics are first, that we have to revalue the work of care. And then we have to invest in human capacity development for all genders, races, orientation, for all people without exception, recognizing that the real wealth of nations is in its people. Investment in developing and caring for people across the lifespan, as well as care for the earth, pays dividends into our economy and our quality of life. We move toward partnerism when people recognize the vast economic, social, and environmental benefits of those investments by making, when we make the investments being made by people who are caring for others. Next slide. So how do we get there?
First, by measuring the value of care. Second, by making visible the connection between the devaluation of care and cycles of poverty. Third, by developing cohesive policies to support partnership families. And fourth, by making the business case for the value of care, showing in dollars and cents the real economic value of care.
Next slide. We have to move from domination to partnership in our social system, including with the family. Riane?
Yes, I'd like to start here. As I said, what we're really talking about, you cannot add a society that does not have racism to a fundamentally imbalanced system, a domination system in which in
Next
both
slide.
the state and the family, you have these rankings of domination. Why? Because neuroscience shows that starting from birth, our brains are really not fully formed, when we're born. They develop in interaction with our environment. The culture is mediated through families, education, religion, media, politics, economics. So starting at birth, our exposure to either domination or partnership relations, and it's always a matter of degree, directly impacts how our brains develop and hence how we think, how we feel, how we act, including how we vote. And this is where we first learn to respect the rights of others, or where we first learn that violence, cruelty, exploitation, oppression, and prejudice are just normal, just the way things are, because that's not true. Next slide, please.
These
So I'm
links between the
asking you
quality of early
to
childhood and economic success are made newly visible by recent neuroscience findings. We know now that more than 1 million new neural connections are formed every second in the first 3 years of life, that 85% of human brain architecture is formed in the first 5 years of life, and that a child's relationship with their primary caregivers is a decisive factor in the quality of that architecture.
next slide. Okay, well, you can see it on the screen. And by the way, my newest book, published with Oxford University Press last year, Nurturing Our Humanity, has this evidence in it. And I really urge those of us who are fighting for a more just, yes, and a more equal society that is not based on in-group versus out-group thinking, which children learn very early on in those early years, that you really look at that book and look at the evidence and really think that to really change racist thinking, acting, voting, we have to have whole systems change. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right, next slide, please. Now, this is something that you really may be already familiar to you. And I see in the chat from Delaney, yes, being taught in-group and out-group thinking is a form of trauma. Absolutely. It goes along with being raised in families and subcultures or cultures that orient to the domination side. Why? Because children in these families learn that top-down rankings and in-group versus out-group thinking practices and policies are normal, even moral. Denial, whether it's climate change denial, racism denial, denial of the pandemic, now denial of the results of the election, it's built into these systems where children are really traumatized because the people on whom they depend on uh, for food, for life, for shelter, I also call them pain. So they are taught by the authority figures. This is really fundamental, to deflect their fear, their rage, their pain to outgroups designated by those authority figures. And they tend to vote for strongman leaders, especially in times of rapid technological, social, and economic change like ours, when we're rapidly shifting from the industrial to the post-industrial economy. Why? Because authoritarian structures feel familiar and hence safe. So this is why promoting an authoritarian, male-dominated, highly punitive family, if you think about it, has been a priority of people who subscribe to racism and other forms of in-group versus out-group thinking. And I want to say that gender really comes into this because they have a model of our species where the male form is superior to the female form. And so they have a template for all rankings of equating difference. Yes, difference, whether it's based on race, religion, whether it's Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia, whether it's white versus black, whether it's anti-Semitism. It's really why promoting an authoritarian, male-dominated, high punitive family was a priority for Hitler, for Stalin, rightist, leftist, for Khomeini in Iran, for Taliban, for ISIS, for the rightist fundamentalist alliance here. It is a priority for people who subscribe to racism and other forms of in-group versus out-group thinking. So if you think now in whole systems terms, you see that racism in the United States is one of the characteristics of a society that still orients largely to domination, not completely, and that's the good news. We've been moving towards partnership. I mean, the whole, whether it was the abolitionist movement or the civil rights movement or the Black Lives Matter movement, whether it was the feminist movement, whether it was the environmental movement, challenging our once hallowed conquest of nature, they're all challenges to a system of domination. And we have been trying to change it, but it's been done in bits and pieces. So think of it now in whole systems terms. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over now to Sharon, who, by the way, has been one of our wonderful alumni of the Center for Partnership Studies, online, really education, which I highly recommend to you. Go to centerforpartnership.org. But Sharon, please go ahead. She's outstanding.
Thank you. 3 keys to moving caring economics and moving to a caring economy and multiracial partnership democracy. We look at 3 keys here. One is public policy, moving public policy. The other is restorative practices. And then the third we look at is coalition building. Next slide. So as we look at public policy changes, we want to promote policies that provide meaningful supports to women and men who do the work of care. We look at promoting policies that help dismantle racism and discriminatory practices of any kind. We want to promote policies that recognize the harm of racism and helps to restore those harmed by racism. We look at policies that fully fund transformative education, including early childhood and family education, so we can break down those walls of authoritarianism and the harm done by it. And we want to promote transforming measures of our wealth the wealth of our nation to social wealth indicators instead of things like GDP. Next slide.
It's quite simple, really. We measure what we want to see grow. And if we want to grow our social wealth, we need to measure it.
Next slide, please. All right, if you really think about it, remember when I said that conventional economic thinking, be it capitalist or socialist, leaves out the three life-sustaining sectors, the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, and the household economy. The unaccounted value of the invisible economy is estimated at 10.8 trillion globally. So really, partnerism and caring economics include huge value generators that make visible the hidden economy and invest in human development that, yes, that leads to the so-called high quality human capital, that economists keep talking about, that's needed to grow our economy in our post-industrial knowledge service age. And I cannot emphasize this enough because we really have to put reality right side up. Not only is the work of caring paid poverty wages, and it's done, yes, very largely by women and men of color, but it is not supported in these United States, in this wealthy nation, by public policy. We don't have paid parental leave, the only developed nation that doesn't have it. We don't have freely accessible high quality early childhood education. And really, you have to really think of what do we value here? So I am suggesting to you that if you're going to change racism and its results, you really have to have systemic change. And that means shifting from a domination system to a partnership system, and shifting to caring, giving visibility and value to the most essential human work, caring for people starting at birth and caring for our life-sustaining natural environment. Next slide, please.
Which is why, over the past 10 years, the Center for Partnership Studies has pioneered the development of social wealth economic indicators, or SWAYs. These new measures do something that's not part of other proposals for alternative measures. The SWAYs measure both the inputs to social wealth, how much business and social investment in care we see, and the outputs of those investments. How much are humans and our environments actually flourishing?
Next slide, please.
So the thing about GDP, despite all its flaws, is that it's easy to use, as it consists of one number. And our goal is to develop a social wealth index that condenses and updates the SWAYs, showing the relationship between care investment and human capacity, and hence economic health and a thriving population and planet.
Next slide, please. So I really want to emphasize this. If we found in our research at the Center for Partnership Studies in developing these new indicators that it is not coincidental that the United States invests the least of any developed nations in family support and has the highest child poverty, much of it, yes, combined with racism, of course, falling on Latina, African Americans, etc., that it has the highest infant mortality rate of any developed nations and the highest maternal mortality rate. This is unacceptable, and we can and must change it. And we need new metrics. We are now working on a social wealth index, condensing, as you heard, these 24 social wealth economic indicators into one number to document the enormous economic value of the work of care, its key role in building a nation's workforce, and what investments, this is essential, are needed to overcome racism, build a better quality of life for all, and a strong economy. Because when you really think about it, you know, this care, which has been relegated to the soft, to the feminine, not for real men, right? And so there's always money for prisons, right? You know, the punitive male head of households, or for weapons and wars, the hero is killer. But somehow we don't have enough money for caring for people, for health care, for child care, for paid family leave. This makes no sense because when accurately accounted for, care emerges as both a prime mover of economic wealth and a reliable indicator of a nation's current and future social well-being and economic vitality, especially, as I said, in our post-industrial age. And that's why we're emphasizing here in this workshop whole systems change as being essential to lay the institutional values, yes, the groundwork for ending racism. Next slide, please. And I want to bring this out again, because if you really think about it, as I mentioned, you know, that there's always money for prisons, for weapons, you know, associated with the stereotypically masculine, nothing to do with women or men. It is taught, and you have very rigid gender stereotypes in domination systems, which fortunately we're beginning to move away from. But think about it, where women are devalued, masculine priorities, so-called masculine, okay, become fiscal priorities, and you have a higher investment in weapons, wars, prisons, and systemic racial oppression. Where women are highly valued, and we see this in the Northern European nations that have moved more to the partnership side, Sweden, Finland, Norway, where women are 40 to 50% of the national legislature. So men, as the status of women rises, men also don't find it such a threat to their status, to their so-called masculinity, to value this, quote, women's work of caring, where women are highly valued, so-called feminine priorities become fiscal priorities, and you have what we need, a higher investment in care of nature, because otherwise we've lost our life support systems, and all humans, regardless of gender, race, or other differences. We're talking about whole systems change as the basis for ending racism in the United States. Next slide, please. Well, we have a breakout room.
Yes, we have a breakout now.
So can you discuss in your small groups what policies you think will support caring for people and the earth as well? And they're really interchangeable, they're related. Public policies that can help dismantle racism and repair the harms done by racism. And please enlist a scribe who can report back to the group.